I am genuinely honored to welcome all of you both in person and online to this conference, D. Michael Quinn, The Life and Times of a Mormon Historian. It was just under a year ago that our community lost a titan, a man whose scholarship helped transform a field. Today, we gather to engage, discuss, and reflect on his many legacies. I'm thrilled to see so many here who have been touched by Mike's work and example. And to remind us that as influential Mike was as a scholar, he was also a beloved person. We are thrilled to have in attendance several of his immediate family, and we're grateful that they'll be coming in and out throughout the day. I also want to thank Maxine Hanks, who you'll be hearing from in a few minutes, for initially proposing the idea of this conference. I agreed to do it on the condition that we could get enough sponsors to make it possible and do it justice. Fortunately, many institutions jumped at the opportunity to help, a reflection of Mike's lasting reputation. I'd like to thank the University of Utah's Mormon Studies Initiative, Utah State University's Leonard J. Arrington Chair of Mormon History and Culture, and the Mormon History Association for sponsoring the physical space in which we are meeting, including covering our free parking. Thanks to the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University for sponsoring our plenary speaker, Neil J. Young. Thanks to Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, for sponsoring box lunches for the first 100 registrants. And thanks to the Sunstone Foundation and the Smith Pettit Foundation for covering the travel costs for several of our scholars. Historical scholarship can only be as good as the community that supports it, and it is clear that the community came through for this event. A few quick points of business before we get to our first panel. We should have enough time for discussion for about 30 minutes at the end of each session. Please raise your hand and the panel moderator will call on you. Please be brief, frame your questions in the form of a question, and the moderator will then summarize your question for our Zoom audience. And I also want to emphasize at this time for all panelists, please make sure to speak directly into this microphone. And so when we get to the Q&A period, when you are answering questions, in order for our Zoom audience to hear, you will have to come all the way over here and answer into the microphone. And I apologize for that. If you are attending through Zoom and would like to ask a question, please do so through the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. If you received an email that said you were one of the first 100 registrants for this conference, box lunches will be available following the second section. Gary Topping, the author of the new biography, D. Michael Quinn, a Mormon Historian, will be signing copies during the lunch break. And please also visit the booths set up by Signature Books, Benchmark Books, and the Mormon History Association that are located right outside into the lobby. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, please turn off your cell phones or any noise-making devices. Even if you think you have already done so, do me a favor and do so again. Without further ado, let's get this event started. I'm happy to turn the microphone over to Dr. Paul Reeve, the Simmons Professor of Mormon Studies here at the University of Utah, who will deliver a land acknowledgement as well as introduce our first panel.
So it's my pleasure to directly that way and then to the left a little bit and down the hall. Yeah. Yes. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the University of Utah. We recognize and acknowledge that our conference today takes place on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes the enduring relationships between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We are grateful for the territory upon which we gather. We respect Utah's indigenous peoples, the original stewards of this land. And we value the sovereign relationships that exist between tribal governments, state governments, and federal governments. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel and moderate this panel today. I will introduce each panelist in the order that they will present. Note that Maxine will join us via video. So for her turn, I will come up and play her video remarks. and we will go in the order in your program. Gary James Bergera is the managing director of the Smith Pettit Foundation, and until a month ago, the company director of Signature Books, both of Salt Lake City, Utah. He is author, co-author, or editor, co-editor of 7 books. Most recently, he edited the Diaries of Leonard J. Arrington, published in 3 volumes as Confessions of a Mormon Historian. His publications have received awards from the Mormon History Association, the Utah Historical Society, and the Dialogue Foundation. He currently serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Mormon History and the John Whitmer Historical Association Journal. He is the 2018 recipient of the Leonard J. Arrington Lifetime Achievement Award from the Mormon History Association. His remarks today are titled D. Michael Quinn, A Remembrance. After Gary, we will hear from Dr. Sara Patterson. She is professor of theological studies and gender studies at Hanover College, where she teaches courses in theology, history of Christianity, and religion in the Americas. She is the author of several books, including most recently, Pioneers in the Attic, Place and Memory Along the Mormon Trail, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Her remarks today are titled The Straitjacket of Time, narrating D. Michael Quinn. We will then hear from Maxine Hanks. Maxine is an independent scholar of gender studies, focusing on gender in LDS history and theology and gender in Christian liturgy. She did her bachelor's in gender studies and her master's work in history, as well as in clinical pastoral education, and a theology fellowship at Harvard. She is pursuing doctoral work in theology. She co-taught the course Women in Mormon Culture at the University of Utah for a decade in the 1990s and has guest lectured at many other schools. She has authored or co-authored several books and articles on Mormon history, gender, or theology, including the 1992 feminist anthology, Women and Authority. Her remarks today are titled Michael Quinn as Dissenter in Mormon History. And then finally, we will hear from Dr. Sujey Vega. She is the faculty head for Arizona State University's American Studies BA and MA program, an associate professor of women and gender studies, and affiliate faculty member in the School of Transborder Studies and Religious Studies at Arizona State University. She has several publications centering on the Latino LDS experience and is currently writing her second book, tentatively entitled Latino Mormons, Faith, Community, and Cultural Identity. Sujey is also the director of ASU's Community Collaborative Initiative, which trains graduate and undergraduate students in community-engaged pedagogy. Her remarks today are titled Michael Pena Quinn, a Chicano with Gringo attitude and experience.
Mike Quinn stands as one of the preeminent historians of Mormonism of the last quarter of the 20th century. During those years, his stature, contributions, and impact were singular. For many readers of the period, myself included, Quinn personified the new Mormon history. Fresh, exhilarating, exciting. Quinn was probing, articulate, thoughtful. His knowledge of and access to the historical sources were deep and far-reaching. On a personal level, he was captivating, engaging, charming. I don't know if there had ever been another Mormon historian of his caliber before him, but so far, I honestly haven't seen another historian of his truly profound impact. I've been invited this morning to share a few personal reminiscences of Quinn, including from the point of view of someone who worked with him as an editor. From late 1984 to 2000, I was the director of Signature Books, one of his publishers. From 2001 to the present, I directed the Smith Pettit Foundation. In both positions, I interacted with Quinn on professional and personal levels, dealing notably with his scholarship and writing. I should note that my own relationship with Quinn is complicated, sometimes turbulent. I admired, respected, usually liked him enormously. At other times, he was infuriating and drove me crazy, and we both promised we would never work with each other again. a promise we repeatedly broke. As a historian, Quinn was an exhaustive researcher. I don't know that he ever met a footnote he couldn't make longer. He was careful, insightful, and often correct. He was not infallible, but one disagreed with his analyses at one's own risk. As a writer, he felt very strongly about his use of words, grammar, punctuation, syntax. When he disagreed with the editing of his texts, he could be annoying to the point of bullying. His comments to the editor uppercased, underlined, lecturing, condescending. He was stubborn and sometimes obdurate to his own detriment. He tended to resist help when it clearly improved his work, yet at the same time, he also expressed insecurity in his abilities as a writer. He tended to compare himself to the world's great authors, and as a result, lamented that he could never measure up to their standard. In fact, a general tendency to self-criticism riddled aspects of his life. For example, he believed that he had failed as a husband and father, insisting that some of his critics at Brigham Young University were much better men than he. Quinn was deeply scarred, emotionally and psychologically, more, I believe, than he himself acknowledged, by his father's attempt to recast his life not as Mexican, but as Anglo, as well as by his grandmother's misandry and erotophobia, not to mention his church's homophobia and anti-gay policies. As a public figure, intellectual, and role model, Quinn exuded confidence, intelligence, poise, equanimity. He was friendly, disarming, encouraging, genuinely interested in others. More than a few of his students loved him. When he resigned from BYU in 1988, at the relatively young age of 44, he expected to easily find employment elsewhere. It turned out that he had miscalculated, that his expectations were too high. He had at least 2 opportunities to teach at community colleges, but declined because he found the teaching loads too heavy and the salaries too low. Other academic opportunities in which he was more interested proved to be unreachable due to personal and political controversies. And he refused to seek employment outside the academy, fearing that such jobs would adversely impact his ability to teach and research again. From 1988 until his death, he lived from fellowship to fellowship, from writing contract to writing contract, and from credit card to credit card, until his mother's estate and his Social Security benefits afforded him a modicum of comfort. From about 2010 on, when he realized that he would never teach again, his scholarly output slowed considerably. I would be surprised to learn that any of the projects that he had worked on during his final decade were anywhere near completion. Quinn was well known for describing himself as a DNA Mormon, even after his expulsion from the LDS Church in 1993. Quinn's continuing belief in the LDS Church may be difficult for some people to understand, let alone accept. Yet his testimony of the fundamentals of Mormonism, a testimony that God lives, that Jesus died for the sins of humanity, that God continues to speak to his children, that Joseph Smith was God's prophet, and the Book of Mormon God's book, were in fact as real for him as any objective event in history. Quinn genuinely believed that his approach to history not only served the LDS Church's best long-term interests, but was sanctioned by God according to God's direct revelation to him. To my mind, Quinn's greatest contributions to scholarship are 5-fold. First, he was the standard bearer for the New Mormon history. He was not the only New Mormon historian, but for many of us, he represented the very best of the New Mormon history's emphasis on balance, transparency, and adherence to the historical sources. Second, Quinn may be the most dogged, probing researcher of the Mormon past who ever was. For years, he spent hours daily transcribing and taking verbatim notes from the historical records of the recently opened LDS Church Historian's Office, Historical Department, and other repositories. He described himself during these years as a Mormon monk. More than anyone else before him and for years after him, Quinn benefited from the openness that LDS apostle and church historian Howard Hunter inaugurated at LDS headquarters. Other historians were equally exemplary scholars, but Quinn's access to the past seemed preternatural. While usually reluctant to make his research materials available to other writers, Quinn did occasionally share his notes on specific topics. Third, Quinn may be the most honest Mormon historian ever. I don't mean to suggest that other historians were or are not as honest, but I don't believe there was ever a topic Quinn shied away from. In fact, if Quinn ever felt pressure from himself or others not to explore a particular topic, such pressure merely served to further animate and propel his research interests. Fourth, Quinn's detailed studies of the LDS hierarchy, including his expanded biography of J. Reuben Clark, are masterclasses in historic narrative and, in my opinion, will never be excelled. Fifth and finally, Quinn's path-breaking explorations of LGBTQ Mormon history mapped relatively new territory in Mormon history. Future studies owe a major debt to Quinn's pioneering efforts. Mike Quinn was one of heaven's complicated, contradictory creations. His death leaves a permanent void in the universe. I'd like to close by reading 4 excerpts from Quinn's memoir, Chosen Path, which he completed in 2009-2010, then set aside, but is now slated for publication by Signature Books. Quinn's picaresque autobiography, drawn from his diaries, which Brian Buchanan is preparing for publication, and from his own memories, is structured as a heavily annotated chronology. The first entry I would like to share is dated April 26, 1973. At every stage in researching and writing Mormon history, I asked God's guidance for me to know how to tell the truth in love. I felt that this would be a strength to Mormons and a resource for LDS leaders. Yet it's fair to ask why I chose to research and write about controversial topics of the Mormon past. At the time, I felt I was simply trying to understand problem areas and provide a means for faithful understanding. But now I realize that there were subconscious factors operating in my choices as a Mormon historian. First, I sought out areas of apparent ambiguity or contradiction in the LDS Church's past and tried to resolve them. That was something I hadn't been able to do with the ambiguity and contradiction within me. Second, I now realize that I saw my father reflected in the Church's official concealment of its controversial past. I was as determined to uncover the secrets of the Mormon past as I was to discover those of my father's Mexican heritage. After all, the leaders of the LDS Church had been an earthly father substitute for most of my life. Third, I now also realize that I saw the LDS Church in my exact situation, outwardly happy and prospering, but burdened with unspoken secrets and wounds that needed to be opened for the process of healing and health. Yes, I hope to obtain some vicarious comfort by bringing a resolution for the Mormon experience that I couldn't give to my own life. While I must admit that there has been a lot of subconscious projection in my choices as a Mormon historian, I have always done my best to recreate the Mormon experience as accurately and fully as the available sources allowed. I have hoped that Jesus, Joseph, and Brigham would approve of my efforts. I still do, even though current LDS leaders would eventually make it clear that they didn't like my stirring up the past. Another echo of Dad. The second excerpt is dated January 22, 1980. I loved God, the church, and the flesh, and I felt that by repressing the third love, I would find complete fulfillment in acceptable ways through the first two loves. Could the destructive results of choosing the way of the carnality that was natural for me from ages 10 to 18 have been any worse than the ultimate damage I have caused, am causing, and will cause by rejecting those carnal options and seeking to be a spiritual Mormon husband, father, potential apostle, and God in embryo? I honestly wonder if I had taken the many possible roads to the homosexual sensuality that was natural to me, if the outcome could have made me more miserable than I am now. I don't think I could have felt as bad about the unhappiness such a course would have brought to my family as I now feel about the unhappiness it has brought to my wife and will ultimately bring to my family anyway. The road I have taken has expanded the circle of misery without enabling me to do a lot of good in the lives of others. I cannot recapture that lost option because if I now took the opportunity, such as it is, For the sensual life I have rejected for 25 years, it would not undo the shambles of my present life, and it would not bring much sexual contentment either, since I am now nearly asexual, burned out by repression. I look at myself, what I am, and what it is logical that I can expect to be, and I ask, has it been worth all of the above for me to be a revisionist writer of LDS history, a silver-tongued orator at occasional church meetings, and an inadequate and indifferent low-level church administrator? God only knows, and I am in his hands, as I have always wanted to be. Quo vadis, that should be a declaration. Should that be a declaration or a question of my life? How many LDS marriages are like mine? God have mercy on those of us who have failed so miserably while trying so hard to be good and fulfill your will. The third excerpt is brief and is dated May 14, 1982. Confrontation and criticism have never been goals in my work as a Mormon historian, but they have become results of publishing. Nevertheless, sanitizing the past was something I felt God did not require of me or anyone else. I could not agree to tailor the Mormon past to conform to the historical knowledge of current general authorities, nor accommodate their preferences for public relations. The final excerpt is the conclusion of his memoirs. Quinn is now in his mid-60s, is 21 years away from BYU, and has not been able since then to secure full-time employment. He writes, with their emphasis on the path of Mormonism I chose, these already too long memoirs have neglected my efforts since the late 1980s to explore male-male intimacy. This uncharted terrain deserves as much attention as my chosen path, especially since the two were intertwined from my mid-40s onward. Because these memoirs avoid the first, they have skipped years at a time after I resigned from BYU's faculty and merely skim over the important events in my dwindling path of choice since 1987. I admit that there should be a post-1987 narrative as detailed as these memoirs are for the earlier period. Still, I want to delay such an account until I've had a long-term relationship of love and intimacy with another male. My old man's version of what gay lovers and evangelical troubadours Jason and DeMarco sing about in their album Till the End of Time. I would like to think of this future boyfriend looking over my shoulder as I chronicle our first meeting. We might even call each other husband. Then he can write the conclusion in his own words. Like the gay boy's song to his aging male lover, I'll follow you into the dark. It won't matter if he's not a Mormon in background or belief. It might be easier for us both if he isn't. God knows. Thank you.
Good morning. The snow may never slush upon the hillside. By 9 p.m., the moonlight must appear. In short, there's simply not a more congenial spot for happily ever aftering than here in Camelot. It's hard not to sing that. The lyrics capture the premise of the story. They claim that Camelot is a perfect and ordered place, yet as we quickly learn, the idyllic Camelot, untouched by disorder or calamity, cannot be sustained because of human flaws. When called Camelot, Leonard Arrington's reign as church historian and Mike Quinn's promising place in it suggest a past that was Edenic and a past that could yet return, where historians and the church are not seen at odds with one another. While the once and hoped for future Camelot is but one narrative in which we have trapped Mike Quinn, it certainly isn't the only one. As historians and lovers of history, we need to free Mike Quinn from the linear chains in which we've bound him. Two narratives in particular hold him hostage: the martyr narrative and the narrative straitjacket of capitalist hetero and theonormativity. In this paper, I will explore both entrapment narratives and suggest that perhaps the best way to understand Quinn and his life is instead the concept of queer time, a notion that will liberate Quinn and his memory from their captors. The first of these narratives, the martyr narrative, is present in the discourse around Quinn, especially among liberal progressive Mormons. Most recently, this can be seen in Ben Park's podcast interview on Radio West. Hi, Ben. In it, Park notes that to some, Quinn is a hero, a martyr figure, and a, quote, person who fought against the institution, trying to preserve the validity of true investigation, end quote. The martyr narrative is persuasive precisely because of its simplicity and its romance. It is about someone who sacrifices, often their entire lives, to die either a social or a physical death for the truth. In addition to its declaration that the truth will eventually win out, the martyr story allows communities to assert that the death of the martyr is meaningful. In Quinn's case, we see the meaning tied to concepts of truth and how the truth does not always upend faith, but can deepen it. The martyr narrative suggests that the social or physical death is somehow worth it because of the sacrifice for the community's values. In this case, those of liberal progressive Mormons and to some degree Mormon studies scholars. Yet the martyr story has its problems, and this is something that Quinn himself rightfully acknowledged. While speaking of the persecution early church members faced, he said, quote, "As appealing as the martyr story is for anyone who has been picked on at a personal level, or any group historically, usually it is more complex than that," end quote. While in the Radio West interview, Park stands apart from the martyrization of Quinn, recognizing and reflecting on the appeal of the narrative, he also partakes in its telling. Quote, "What is tragic is while he might have been living alone, he is seen as a beloved figure by tens of thousands of academics, of Mormons, of the marginalized, as a pioneer of LGBTQ history, as someone who is willing to speak truth to power," end quote. In just a few sentences, Park recognizes Quinn as a pioneer, and we all know the weight that that carries. And he hails his importance to so many people, while at the same time mentioning that Quinn was living alone when he died. Why might that be a part of the story as it is so often recounted? Sure, it captures the social death aspect of the martyr story, but I think there is more here. Why does Quinn's aloneness matter in our tellings of his life? Let's hold on to that question as we move to the second narrative. The second narrative has locked Quinn into a linear trajectory that begins with his life as a rising star in church history, recognized for his intellect, married to a beautiful wife, teaching at BYU, and creating a family. His was a life that LDS theology and its social hierarchies dictate as the best. This LDS narrative of progression toward exaltation, I will call it the exaltative narrative, is intertwined with capitalistic, future-oriented, heterosexual production models of time of the broader culture. So these two narratives together rest on three pillars: production, reproduction, and exaltation. Pivotal to this cultural narrative is the child, with a capital C, imagined as symbolic of the future's unquestioned value and meaning's eventual realization. LDS theology takes these broader cultural narratives of production and reproduction even one step further with the plan of salvation, in which the premortal develops into the mortal and eventually the postmortal realm, where because of one's effort, both in terms of production and reproduction, the individual is rewarded for the labor that they have accomplished. It is a theological system that connects the individual to the past as the inheritors of morals and values, and looks ahead to the future familial connections that will come to full fruition for time and eternity. While this narrative is prevalent in virtually every account of his life, it surfaces even in the most recent retelling of Quinn's life, Gary Topping's biography titled D. Michael Quinn. Roughly 80% of the book focuses on the linear rise of Quinn in his scholarship, family life, and career. Quinn's tipping point comes with his recognition that he could no longer live a lie in terms of his sexuality. His colleagues' harassment of him, his loss of access to his temple recommend, and his, quote, realization that martyrdom, both academic and ecclesiastical, probably awaited him, end quote. A dozen or so pages follows Quinn's excommunication, even though he lived almost another 30 years. While Topping describes Quinn's life during that time as, quote, an incongruent mixture of productivity and drift, end quote, recognizing his scholarly productivity after his excommunication, the book also discusses the financial problems that, quote, dogged him constantly, end quote. And the fact that he, quote, was alone in his condominium when he died from a heart attack, end quote. Further, Topping adds that, quote, Quinn had always lived on the edge, personally, intellectually, and ecclesiastically, and thus he had always been, in a sense, alone. So this is Topping, I wonder if there was perhaps something fitting in the fact that he died as he had lived, end quote. And so we have a narrative of linear rise followed by descent. And again, and perhaps most intriguingly, we have a narrative where once he is in his linear fall, the emphasis is placed on Quinn being alone. And so Mike Quinn has been locked into heteroproductive, reproductive, and exaltative linear understandings of time and futurity. It is the concept of queer time, I argue, that we can use to liberate him and see him anew outside of the bounds of how he has been narrated in the past. Queer time upsets the linear notion of time in which we are, quote, enjoined to make all our own pleasures and commitments secondary to a future that never comes and that does not privilege the future at the expense of the present and past, end quote. In the words of Jack Halberstam, queer time is about the unexpected, refusing to live a life scripted by the markers deemed necessary by the broader culture, namely birth, marriage, reproduction, and death, and I would add exaltation. Queer time embraces the present, the partial, and the enjoyment of the momentary, stepping out of the linear and future-oriented narratives that surround us. It disrupts the understanding of meaning taken from a hetero-reproductive model and denies the teleological, the straitjacket of meaning placed on modern understandings of time. Queering time does not mean that members of the LGBTQ community do not want children or have children or a future that cares for those children, but it serves instead as a metaphorical disruption of the imposition of meaning onto life vis-a-vis a future that is always just out of one's grasp. In Quinn's case, it is a rejection of the narratives of the church that put him in a lockstep march toward career, the nuclear family, and the promise of the next life. While I cannot in a short paper explore all the ways that queering time might enable us to see Quinn's life in new ways, I want to hold up two moments in his life in which we might see the value of liberating Quinn from these problematic narratives we have so often told about him. We've told them so frequently that we've come to believe that they make up the narrative of his life, a life which peaked too early and then descended into disintegration, drift, meandering, and meaninglessness. The two moments share one thing in common. They both happened when the church was holding disciplinary councils against Quinn. The first, in July of 1993, disfellowship Quinn. It came after a series of interactions with Paul Hanks, his stake president, who had identified both Quinn's scholarship and his homosexuality as the reasons for the hearing. Quinn's response was moving and firm and pushed back against the narratives being told about him. Quote, I sincerely hope you never are in the situation of being hunted down by those you regard as prophets, seers, and revelators, but who have defined you as expendable, end quote. Sorry. At that time, the council determined that he would no longer be received as a full member in one of his primary social networks. This was simply an extension of the initial loss of his temple recommend, and therefore his access to the temple, the place where he could enact the rituals of his faith that reinforced the larger narratives of the theological worldview supported by the church. Quinn was placed further and further outside of church constructions of time, his future now a big question mark. His divorce and his excommunication rendered him an outsider to the hetero-reproductive theology that the church teaches and taught. Yet, as his fellow church members met to determine his standing, Quinn decided not to engage in the process of the disciplinary council. Instead, he chose to go see the movie Super Mario Brothers. He chose the present moment and a film about a meteorite crashing into the earth and splitting the universe into two dimensions, one with a race of human-like creatures descended from dinosaurs. He chose that to participating in the dissolution of his ties to his social and faith networks and the life narratives he had been taught to value. It was after that movie that he reported feeling a sense of calm coming over him. He had chosen queer time to the constructions of time and his place in it offered by the church community. Not 2 months later, Quinn again refused to take part in a disciplinary council, his final one held on September 26, 1993. Quinn was not in Utah at the time. Instead, he had chosen to attend and present at the Affirmation Conference, a group of LGBTQ+ Mormons. Rather than participating in a process that would sever his connection to church community and institutional authority, Quinn traveled outside the bounds of orthodoxy, both literally and metaphorically, and entered into the community of affirmation. Having read through Affirmation's archive newsletters, I can affirm that Mike Quinn was a superstar at affirmation conferences, along with John Boswell, author of Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, a book that discusses homosexuality in Christian history. Quinn is, of course, mentioned with his book, Same-Sex Attraction. What is clear in the newsletters is the importance of that book to the affirmation community. It provided them with a sense of a usable past, the ability to see that the community stretched back in time and had survived the long haul. Take, for example, the book review written by John Gustav Rothel, future president and executive director of Affirmation. Gustav Rothel knew the impact of church policies and teachings about homosexuality all too well. He had been haunted by the words of Boyd K. Packer as he contemplated death by suicide, believing, quote, that as a gay man, my life had no value, end quote. Reading Quinn's book helped Gustav Rothel see the world differently. Quote, Quinn's portrait of the world we have lost is compelling and moving, even as it poses larger questions about the world we have gained, end quote. Members of Affirmation created a new sense of family, structure, and inheritance, offering alternative histories to the stories told by LDS cultures. They found and lifted up their own pioneers. Sure, they hoped that the presence of earlier tolerance within the church might indicate the coming of a hoped-for future of greater acceptance in the LDS community. But more importantly, they created community in moments and places that stood outside the reach of the narratives of the LDS Church. In these two moments where he disregarded the church's attempt to impose meaning and narratives on his life and chose instead to step outside of church concepts of time, Quinn created his own piece in Queer Time. He created and embraced a new community with its own understandings of time, inheritance, and the future. In so doing, he challenged the narrative impositions that so many have placed on him. The constant reference to his living and dying alone in those imposing narratives that saw his life in a linear descent need reframing. The concept of queer time, of perhaps only brief, but most importantly disruptive moments, can help us better think about Quinn's life. Quinn was a historian who looked to the past for answers to questions about faith, but he was also a man who had learned how to live a solitary life. After resigning from BYU and winning the MHA Best Book Award, he wrote that he, quote, traveled in a solitary manner, even when in MHA members' company, end quote, and that he, quote, was beginning a separate piece with myself, with my sense of mission, with God, end quote. Years later, he described himself as a Mormon mystic, saying that, quote, it's you and me, God, end quote. So while Quinn continued his quest for the truth, he chose to create new understandings of community and faith. He continued his relationship with his God. He continued to have moments of queer time, and he certainly created meaning long after September 1993 in ways that have been overseen and invisibilized by the imposition of the straitjacket of hetero-reproductive, productive, and exaltative linear time. Thank you.
Okay, we will now hear from Maxine Hanks, technology willing.
Hello. I was asked to talk about Mike Quinn. As
Sorry, technical difficulties. We will hear from Maxine in after Dr. Vega.
Sorry, I'm trying to help out here too. Oh, hi, Mike. Different mic. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So actually, I gotta get the PowerPoint up just a second. And let me share the screen. It helps when you've been using Zoom for 2 years. Okay. I want to begin by thanking the Quinn family and Jan for taking the time to talk to me and provide any insight into Mike's enigmatic family history. The title of this presentation, Michael Peña Quinn, a Chicano with Gringo attitude and experience, is taken from his own journal entries while in Mexico. Mike admits that he would prefer to live anywhere except Latin America. Despite being Chicano, I am a gringo in attitude and experience. This juxtaposition between identifying as Chicano while exhibiting an aversion to the actual culture, food, bureaucracy, and toxic masculinity, or what he called machismo, seems to be a contradiction in terms. After initially reading some of Mike's journal and Topping's chapter on ambiguous identities, I felt unsettled about how I would present on this plagued journey between self, lineage, identity, and shame. After I recently told Moshe, his son, I found Mike's entries as I recently told Moshe, his son, I found Mike's entries revealed an underlined yet palpable distaste for Mexico. Though Mike, unlike his father, never hid the fact that he was part Mexican, his time spent in Mexico seemed to confirm why Mike's father wanted to distance himself from his heritage. To say that Mike enjoyed his time in Mexico would be a stretch. Between the homophobia he experienced and the detachment his father created, Mike did not grow to love the land erased from his identity. Exiled and without steady income, Mike was grateful for the home, or rather hacienda, of his friend. But throughout his reflections in Mexico, he seemed more perturbed at his paternal culture. Many Mexican Americans feel a kind of culture shock when first arriving to Mexico. One is unsure of their own cultural competency in the real Mexico. One's accented Spanish becomes almost paralyzing. Many of us, myself included, in this identity limbo, feel the classic Chicano proverb of being not Mexican enough for Mexico, not American enough for America.
Our own hangups and insecurities bubble to the surface the minute our authenticity is called upon. Mike felt this, but in a skewed way. His Americanness and white privilege was never questioned, but here in the land where his grandparents lived, he felt no connection. Rather than learn to embrace this side of his heritage or have what religious studies scholar David Carrasco described as the Aztec moment, when you embrace your Aztec heritage, albeit in Chiapas, not an Aztec area. Mike's gringo attitude was very apparent when speaking of machismo, homophobia, diarrhea, and his overall contempt for the culture and bureaucracy of Mexico. I mean, he boiled, bottled, purified water, for God's sakes. Though Utah certainly exhibited its own toxic masculinity and homophobia, somehow his critique of Mexico's patriarchy felt more pointed, more judgy even. Mike went out of his way to sing the praises of the German language, Europe, and even sought Swiss citizenship because his mother's grandmother was from Born. Yet here he was, living in a hacienda, emphasis added, and finally encountering the culture and people that were denied to him, and still he resisted. In those weeks, he expressed what best can be described as perhaps shame for not knowing the language and customs of his surroundings. Without a positive Mexican role model to train him up in his ethnicity, Mike's father's lifelong goal to diminish and distance himself from all things Mexican may have actually seeped into Mike's own subconscious. To understand the son, I had to try to understand the father. What would lead a Chicano man to cut off his identity, change his name, and close off that part of him to his children? What could have occurred to Daniel Peña, known as Don or Donald Quinn, to deny his family and put on the skin of Donald Quinn? And why was he so desperate to be adopted by the family of his childhood friend, Anthony Quinn? Though Mike's family speculates that it could have been a family conflict with his father and their grandfather, indeed a letter from Anthony Quinn himself notes that Daniel was the eldest and often the wage earner for the family. But even so, why deny his mother, Carmela Peña, and his siblings from being a part of his life? To cut them off completely and to deny his own ethnic identity to pass for white, Donald was clearly troubled. That trauma would echo and reverberate onto Mike's own suppressed negative associations in Mexico. I'd like to use the remaining time to contextualize Donald Quinn's history as a Mexican American in East LA. In doing so, I hope to provide some background on what may have influenced his white passing and how Mike himself, coming of age in the 1960s, may have also navigated Chicano history in his own journey to find himself. Donald Quinn was actually born Daniel Peña, or Dan Peña as it came to be known, in Arizona to Mexican immigrant parents. The family would move to East LA in the area just northwest of the contemporary tourist destination of Olvera Street. Given Peña's Arizona's connection, it is very possible that his family settled near Sonora Town because it was the only place Mexicans were allowed to live at that time. Sonora Town, like Chinatown, came about as a result of segregation and prejudice. Adobe houses, packed dirt floors, and the dominance of Spanish came to define LA's first barrio. Confined to this area of town, it is very likely the Peña family followed other Sonoran Arizona Mexicans to Sonora Town, right? And this is a picture on the black and white picture is of Echo Park, which is about a block away from his family and where they resided, or within walking distance. Once there, what was life like for young Daniel or Dan? Was it home life or living in poverty and a poverty-stricken, neglected, segregated part of LA that influenced his decision later in life to hide who he was? Maybe it was a combination of both. We may never know. But what we do know is he befriended a young Anthony Quinn, pictured here, handsome young man. Long before Anthony would grace the screen of Hollywood's golden age, Dan and Anthony became good friends. Such good friends that Dan asked Anthony's family to adopt him. They could not and likely would not, given their own humble beginnings. We know that sometime in his late teens, Daniel fell out with Anthony Quinn. Once the boys went their separate ways, Daniel decided to put his acting skills to the test. And yes, Anthony Quinn credits Dan's acting experience as an influence for his own career. He informally adopts Quinn as his last name and later changes from Daniel to Donald. And so began his journey to disconnect himself fully from his family and his heritage. But the question remains, why? Could it have been the general anti-Mexican sentiment prevalent at the time that led him to try and pass? Could it have been the deportation and repatriation raids of the 1930s in Los Angeles that led him to deny his family in order to save himself? By 1943, this anti-Mexican antagonism had grown to violence during the Zoot Suit riots. Agitated servicemen went on a rampage and attacked Mexican youth wearing Zoot suits throughout LA. The year after the Zoot Suit riots, Mike was born, and Donald continued the big lie. Wink. If you get it, you get it. It is unclear when exactly Mike found out about his father's actual identity. But it was around the time that the Chicano civil rights movement was well underway. Jan, his wife at the time, recounts that he was never ashamed to be part Mexican, but he never felt he could fully claim it as an identity given that he lived his whole life as a white man. Somewhere along the line, Mike decided to adopt the language of the moment and reference his lineage as Chicano. But to be clear, Chicano means, as Ruben Salazar pointed out, having a non-Anglo image of yourself. Mike was every bit defined by an Anglo image of himself and of his father. To be Chicano also means being politically engaged, or in today's parlance, decolonizing oneself from Anglo and Spanish hegemony while recuperating indigenous identity. Even within Mormonism, there was discussion of what Chicano meant. University of Utah professor Orlando Rivera pointed out in 1978 that there was an underlying superiority complex feeding into the way white Mormons viewed Latinos as linguistically, culturally, and intellectually deficient. It is unclear if Mike ever heard of Dr. Rivera or his interventions on Chicano Mormonism, or how and if Mike interacted with Dr. Ignacio Garcia from BYU's history department. Both Rivera and Garcia were scholars in Mike's reach who openly explored Chicano history, identity, and Mormonism. Yet he himself seemed not to participate in this discussion of Chicano identity. Returning to Mike's time in Mexico, he entitled his journal, A Journey of a Gringo Chicano in Mexico. But how can we interpret the use of Chicano here? As his family has explained, Mike was always aware of his genealogical ties to Mexico, but it was not lineage, not identity that he recognized. It was lineage, not identity that he recognized. Mike eventually did speak to his half-sisters from his father's second marriage and heard about an Uncle Jimmy, Daniel's brother. Beyond finding some genealogical ties to a fishing town near the Gulf of Mexico, as far as we know, Mike never delved deeper into his actual Chicano identity or, to be precise, his Mexican-American past. What do we know from his journals? What we do know from his journals is that Mike demonstrates a perhaps unconscious distance, or rather distaste for Mexico that his father laid the groundwork for. Indeed, the town where Mike visited in Chiapas has an active and thriving queer Mexican community, as seen here. In fact, not far from Chiapas are the Zapotec communities of Oaxaca, who have long recognized the Muxe, or gender nonconforming populations of the area. We might call them trans in the US. I wish Mike would have had this experience and would have given Mexico a chance and known of the potential that he had in rescuing that part of him that his father rejected. Alas, Mike passed before that was possible. Thank you.
All right, we're going to try something. Testing. Okay.
Hello. I was asked to talk about Mike Quinn as dissenter in Mormon history. Dissent means to differ with or depart from views commonly or officially held. Mike was a dissenting figure, but far more, he was deconstructive of hegemony, privilege, and its subversion of the other by giving the subverted its due attention and validity as a partner of privilege in a larger dynamic. Mike saw truth in all sides, understanding it on its own terms. The D in D Michael Quinn could have stood for deconstructive, as his major works reveal. His 1981 BYU speech on being a Mormon historian, in response to Elder Packer's BYU talk, "The mantle is far, far greater than the intellect," rejected the hegemony of faith and loyalty over intellect and critique, as if promoting, quote, hero worship over responsible engagement. This rare act of public dissent by a BYU professor triggered a conflict between Elder Packer and Mike that would continue. His 1985 article on post-manifesto polygamy and dialogue deconstructed the view of polygamy as outside of the church, showing that polygamy continued inside the church after 1890, as some church leaders still practiced it into the 1920s. As a result, Elder Packer requested that Mike's stake president revoke his temple recommend, but Mike's stake president simply kept it inside his desk instead. The next year, perhaps in response, the Church Historical Department began requiring researchers to sign an agreement allowing review and approval of any planned use of church materials for publication. Well, Mike refused to sign the agreement, but I was willing to sign it, so Mike enlisted my help with research to continue working with LDS sources without LDS control. The next year, in 1987, Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview deconstructed the Orthodox view of LDS origins as entirely heaven-sent, revealing that they were equally grounded in human agency and esoteric traditions of folk magic and ritual, scrying and seer stones, treasure digging, astrology, and Freemasonry. Mike proposed a new paradigm for understanding LDS emergence, showing that church narratives had subverted its own esoteric roots from which its visionary, mystic, Christian primitivist religion had arisen. Mike's intent was not to expose weird or embarrassing occult origins, but to reveal the human processes at work in approaching or summoning the divine. Processes utterly authentic for early Mormons. He deconstructed the dichotomy between Protestant Christianity and Western esotericism, which Joseph Smith himself had done. Thus, LDS origins evidenced both, which Mike revealed. This work startled Mormon historians and church leaders alike, eliciting harsh criticism from LDS apologists. In 1992, Mike's article, "Mormon Women Have Had the Priesthood Since 1843," in my book, Women and Authority, deconstructed the 20th century church view that LDS men had priesthood, but women did not. Mike gathered sources that clearly indicated women as well as men were anointed and ordained to priesthood in Joseph Smith's Nauvoo temple rites, and that women and men themselves saw their priesthood ordinations and practices as real. Church reaction to his article and my book in early February 1993 was extreme. Elder Packer had had enough of Mike's deconstructive history. 170 confided, quote, "The issue with Quinn is his intent and motivation. If someone keeps coming up with negative or embarrassing stuff, you have to wonder about that person's motivations. Those motivations must be bad. The senior apostles are very concerned about Quinn, and I'm surprised and impressed at the church's enormous patience with Quinn." End quote. It was a tragic misinterpretation, an assumption of ill intent, when the real problem was a colossal gap between institutional and scholarly perspectives. In early February, our mutual stake president summoned Mike and I for interviews. We were in the same stake. Mike refused to attend, but I was willing, yet my attempt to solve concerns failed. In early May, Area 70 Lauren Dunn invited me and Mike to meet with him. Mike refused to go, but I was willing, again, hoping to solve concerns. And again, my attempt failed. I asked Elder Dunn why the brethren disliked Mike's article and my book. He said, "It gave us heartburn." And he requested that we stop publishing feminist views, which, quote, "serve no purpose," end quote. I had to decline his request. Mike was summoned and disciplined by the church 3 times that year, which is kind of a magic formula itself. The church tried to conjure his presence for probation, disfellowshipment, and excommunication, but he never appeared. He just kept slipping away. In September 1993, Mike and I were called to High Council discipline. This time we both refused to attend. Likewise, other dissenters were summoned that month. Lavina Fielding Anderson elected not to attend her disciplinary council. Lynn Whitesides, Abraham Gileadi, and Paul Toscano were willing to participate in theirs, hoping for a positive outcome. All of us were excommunicated except Lynn, who renegotiated her membership. Mike and I were excommunicated for our writings in Women in Authority and our statements in the media, but mainly for not showing up to our disciplinary council, according to the stake president. This church confrontation with dissenting scholars and feminists in 1993, termed the September 6th, had to happen because the church had to deal with dissenting public discourse that engaged the avoided, feared, repressed, unseen aspects of our past and our Mormon identity. Or at least it had to deal with those who had been dealing with those aspects. Elder Packer's May 1993 speech to the All Church Coordinating Council, naming the 3 greatest dangers to the church as scholars, feminists, and homosexuals, had identified the LDS shadow and its shadow workers. Many other scholars and feminists were called for church discipline or BYU dismissal in 1993 and afterwards in the 1990s, several of whom negotiated a solution. Mike had left BYU in 1988, so he couldn't be fired. Yet David Knowlton, Cecilia Conchar-Farr, Gail Houston all lost their BYU jobs. And even Gene England, Scott Abbott, Martha Bradley, and others felt constrained to leave BYU. The excommunications continued in 1994 for Brent Metcalf and David Wright, and in 1995 for Janice Allred, followed by Margaret Toscano in 1999. The 1990s endured the church's public collision with its scholarly self, after which the church began embracing public scholarly discussion in 2000 and onward. In 1996, Mike's book, Same-Sex Dynamics Among 19th Century Americans, A Mormon Example, again deconstructed institutional 20th century LDS views by revealing that queerness, homosocial dynamics, and same-sex relationships were actually tolerated or accepted in the 19th century church, rather than seen as indecent, perverse, or scandalous, even as late as the 1930s and 40s. For example, a few prominent church leaders had same-sex relationships, and Brigham Young preferred men-only dancing. Mike showed that Mormon attitudes towards same-sex dynamics were much like those across the US and Europe at that time, until the watershed trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895 triggered hostility for queerness on both continents. Mike deconstructed the heterosexist view of homosexuality as other, revealing that Mormonism itself was a bit queer. Last, his magna opera, the Mormon Hierarchy Trilogy, stunningly revised the history of LDS authority, leadership, and finances by excavating the complexities in each, as well as Joseph Smith's intended balance and egalitarianism within hierarchical structures. Origins of Power in 1994 revised our understanding of Joseph's and Brigham's different approaches to church authority and leadership, revealing a drastic shift after Joseph died. Mike Quinn documented that the church's leading decision-making bodies, as he called them, had been designed to counterbalance each other, yet Brigham Young had consolidated authority in the 12 and himself as president, subverting Joseph's balance of powers and genders. His 1997's extensions of power deconstructed our idealized notions of unified monolithic church leadership, revealing the individuality, personalities, and conflicts between leaders who often opposed each other in complex power dynamics. And 2017's Wealth and Corporate Power, 40 years in the making, truly his magnum opus, recovered an exhaustingly complex history of LDS finances, showing that business enterprises owned or managed by the church had benefited the church as well as its leaders. For example, Brigham Young, who had $1 million when he died. Yet Mike's book also attested that church financial growth in the 20th century was a miraculous story. The significance and impact of Mike Quinn's deconstructive work on dichotomies and privilege in Mormon history, which he felt had betrayed Mormonism's inclusive origins, cannot be overstated. His work excavated the foundations of LDS faith in ways that recovered its syncretic, inclusive identity, vision, integrity, and truths, along with its tragic flaws. He revealed the paradoxes that inhabit Mormon origins, and he refuted the polemics that responded to those paradoxes. If I had to pick the four most crucial deconstructions in Mike Quinn's body of work, it would be his recovery of Mormonism's marriage of esoteric tradition and biblical religion in early Mormonism and the magic worldview, and the historic equality of women's ordinations. In Mormon women have had the priesthood since 1843, and the historic inclusion of LDS queerness documented in same-sex dynamics, a Mormon example, and his stunning deconstruction of apostolic hegemony in 1844 to 47 that subverted Joseph Smith's intended balance of authority, power, and gender, as documented in Mike's Mormon Hierarchy, Origins of Power. Mike Quinn himself was deconstructive in his own life and identity. He embodied opposites, Anglo and Latino, an academic from a working class family, a professor made in the military, an authority from the margins, queer studies scholar with essentialist views, a heretic critic, an Orthodox believer, a linear thinker and a mystic, a gay male feminist scholar. He was all three of Mormonism's greatest dangers. His own intersecting identities enabled him to see and value many perspectives. His gift for paradox made him abhor polemics. He condemned polemic criticisms of his or anyone's work, calling polemicist a dishonorable vocation. He said, polemics intentionally destroy the give and take of sincerely respectful disagreement. Like Joseph Smith, Mike believed that by proving contraries, the truth is made manifest, and that we should gather all the good and true principles in the world, or we shall not come out true Mormons. Mike was a true Mormon. He relied on intellectual and spiritual methods in his research. I once asked him, do you ever feel like someone is standing there on the other side of the veil just handing documents to you? Yes, he said. How do you think I find all those sources? He explained that each time he started a project, he prayed for divine direction to find what he needed, and he did. Last, a word about reconciliation. Mike's 40-year role as LDS historical gadfly and deconstructive lever didn't render him simply a tragic figure as he's so often portrayed. Mike's body of work was an extraordinary success. Mike did what he was destined to do in life and in Mormon studies. The church may never see or agree with all that Mike saw, but it will be waiting there in his texts. In 2011, Mike was invited by LDS Historical Department to consult with them on research about polygamy, especially post-manifesto polygamy. This event brought Mike full circle from the first article that had gotten him into trouble in 1985 to being invited by the church to assist them on that same topic 25 years later. Rather than balk at the extraordinary irony, Mike was thrilled to be needed, valued, and useful to the church. It was a healing event. In 2012, my return to LDS membership was aided by Mike's advice and mentoring every step of the way. As karmic partners in excommunication, we were karmic partners again in my recommunication as I worked to try to heal what happened in 1993. He participated in my process, which caused him to consider returning himself, but he opted not to while I went ahead. He couldn't abide membership given the church policy on LGBTs, but he did feel that I was meant to return. And so he supported and accompanied me on a soul level. Yet Mike too was reinstated in another way. In 2019, a public expose of church tithing investments revealed funds totaling $100 billion. I called Mike to tell him the news and sent him the articles. So he gave the media his deeply informed, objective perspective on the controversy over tithing funds, explaining why such funds were needed and how, in the larger picture, he said, the church is not a profit-making business, and that church finances are actually, quote, an enormously faith-promoting story, end quote. When his comments were quoted on the LDS Church newsroom in defense of the church, with a description and link to his book, The Mormon Hierarchy, Wealth and Corporate Power, on Amazon.com, I called him to tell him the news. Rather than scoff at the incredible irony, he was ecstatic to learn that he'd been used by the church to defend itself against harsh criticism. For Mike, it was more about deconstructing polemics than about defending the institution, yet he was thrilled that his work was finally recognized by the church as providing a deeper, complex history of the reality and also a testimony of a truly miraculous story. I told Mike, you realize what this means. You've been reinstated by the church without rebaptism. He loved that and agreed that the church's public reconciliation with his relentlessly honest, probing historical work had reversed the reason for his excommunication. And that was even better than baptism. Thank you.
Maxine, if you're on, if you could turn your video on so we can so you can join us.
It says I can't start the video because the host has stopped it. There we go.
Okay, we have time for questions. Please remember to state your questions in the form of a question, to be brief. I will have to repeat the question for our video audience, so you test my ability if you go on too long. And then please just let us know who you're directing the question to, and they will come up and answer. So any questions from the audience? Yes, go ahead.
Can't hear anything.
So the question is for Gary, and talking about the possibilities of disagreement in the early church. Acceptability for disagreement in the early church.
So you'll have to remind me, what was the context that I said that? The five contributions that Mike makes? Uh-huh. I honestly don't recall saying that. Did I read it? So this was from Quinn then. This was from his memoir. I think that what he was talking about was pre-1973 and post-1973. So when he came on, when Leonard Arrington hired him, there was this huge explosion in scholarship and in access to the materials. And then as the materials started being published, that's when there was pushback. And so I think that's what Mike is talking about, that period before they started publishing some of the original sources, and then the period after when it started attracting, and then some of the LDS church leaders, when they saw the kind of material that was coming out, and especially the annotations, and then later the narrative histories, that's what made them more uncomfortable. And that's what Quinn, I think, was referring to, was that change right around 1973, 74, 75. So the time in there definitely was a time. There would be the period of time between Joseph Fielding Smith and Leonard Arrington, when Howard W. Hunter was the church historian. He was church historian for about a year. The archives were really open. I mean, they were more open than they were later, and so there definitely was, and I think that's what Quinn was talking about, was that period when he at least seemed to have full reign to what the church archives had, including the various vaults in the buildings.
Yes, back here. Go ahead. So the question is, how does the panel think Mike would respond or react to this event? Maxine, do you want to go first?
Sure. Mike would be deeply moved, deeply honored, amazed. He would find this very healing and humbling. It would mean everything to him, and I absolutely believe that he is watching us all anyway.
I agree completely with Maxine. I think that Mike would have thoroughly enjoyed this and would have looked forward to being able to meet all of you here and be able to talk about his work and his own life and his everything that he had been involved with. Yeah, I agree with Maxine.
Sujey? No. Okay.
Yeah, so similar, I didn't know him personally. And I think that I would hope that the way he might react is first confirming or denying, right? Some of the sense of that I got from his journal entries, but also I'm hoping that he might take the energy he took to historical explorations in Mormonism, to identifying and incorporating queer experiences, to then that next level of his other identity, right? I the end of my presentation with the Mouche and just in general current queer politics in Mexico, I would hope that he would be encouraged to use that as his next, source of inquiry for his own historical acknowledgement in the area.
Other questions? Yes, over here. So the question is to you, Maxine, and just asking if you would like to respond to the notion that there was a period where it was more open for dissent. The same kind of question that Gary was responding to. Do you have a response to that notion of a period of more openness?
I don't know. It's kind of been up and down all the way along. Yeah, in some ways, the archives, the church historical archives were more open in the 70s and early 80s. But then in 1986, I think partly in response to Quinn's work on post-manifesto polygamy, they, as I mentioned, required that anyone doing research at archives had to sign an agreement that you would allow the church archives and the church to review anything you had found in the archives that you were planning to use for publication. So that was kind of a repression that happened then, which Mike and others got around by having me do the research for them. Then it definitely got worse in the late 80s and the early 90s when we had the purge of 93. And so it was much more repressive then. And the 90s, as I mentioned, became this time in which that confrontation, which really had to happen finally, needed to happen, was very productive and also wrenching and destructive. That actually worked the church and the scholars and feminists through this confrontation, back and forth, so that after Margaret Toscano's excommunication in 99, which kind of brought the decade to an end, she kind of completed us. Then in 2000 onward, the church started sponsoring academic conferences discussing Mormonism, inviting various scholars, including Mike was invited to participate in one of them. So it's a bumpy story. And we're now entering yet another retrenchment regarding the divine feminine. So, we all just keep hanging in there.
Yes, go ahead. So it's my understanding that that's under consideration, but no decision yet if they will be published. Yes, go ahead. So Maxine, the question is for you. The question is, how much do you see really a reconciliation given some of the more recent retrenchment? So how much reconciliation has there been with Michael Quinn's ideas? You mentioned the acceptance from the institutional church, even quoting him in terms of the financial statements. And yet we're still hearing things at BYU that feel like a retrenchment. So the question is, how much of a reconciliation really was there, or is it really still an ongoing retrenchment?
The short answer is it's both. There were aspects of reconciliation, inclusion, healing, forgiveness between the church and Mike, being invited to archives to work, church historical department to work with historians on polygamy, and other invitations, including they really wanted him to come back to the church, but he was unwilling. His integrity and his solidarity with LGBTs, and also with the church's stand on polygamous marriages in Africa, those two issues prevented him from returning. But yeah, there's a tremendous amount of reconciliation, and there's also a tremendous amount of tension. So it's both. The church is big and it's moving in different directions at the same time.
Yes, over here. So the question is, how did Arrington discover Quinn, and evidence regarding interactions between Arrington and Quinn? Gary, probably for you.
So Mike was a graduate student, a master's student in history at the University of Utah, and one of his professors, his primary professor, was Davis Bitton. Davis Bitton was called as the assistant church historian under Leonard Arrington, and that's how they connected. It was through Davis Bitton.
Yeah, Jeff. So Jeff, let me do one at a time, because you're going to really test my abilities here. So for Sara, asking Sara to unpack more possibilities about the ways in which you're suggesting a querying of time with Quinn. Yeah, so we're going to let Sara think about that. Jeff, let's get your other question for Dr. Vega. So the question for Dr. Vega is having to do with Mike grappling with his Mexican heritage, and anything from the diaries, anything that gives insights into grappling with his sexuality on the one hand, and not grappling with his heritage on his Mexican heritage on the other.
So I asked Sara if I can answer first, because I have a faculty meeting in about a minute and I have to run out. So quickly, as far as I know, Mike always accepted his heritage, right? He was definitely open and talked about it. But we have to remember it was denied to him, right? And there was, I mean, anyone that knows anything about family dynamics and parents who kind of shut down conversation know that I'm sure this was a really difficult topic for him, right? And he just didn't have access to that heritage or to that history. So I think that I wouldn't say he denied it or he distanced himself like purposefully. I think it was subconscious, and I think it was because his father denied it for him. In Mexico, I think it was the time that he was there, the fact that he was in exile, the fact that he did face homophobia in Mexico that might have altered the way he interacted there. But I do think that there was opportunities, and he definitely was always willing to talk about it. It wasn't something that he himself was ashamed of, but unfortunately it was his father's kind of influence there. And I wish I could hear Sara's response, but I'm going to have to jump out. But I'll be here for the rest of the conference. I'll talk to y'all later.
I really appreciate your question, and it's something that I want to keep pondering today. But an example that I have thought of from my own experience, I went to Claremont and worked with a historian named Robert Davidoff, who is a historian of the gay experience in the United States. And he and Quinn were friends. So I think those connections with historians of LGBT history were really important to him. And I remember when Robert Davidoff introduced me to Quinn, and I knew the stories, right? But Davidoff put his hand on Quinn's shoulder and said, "He got out." And I, referring to the church. And I just thought that was so interesting. And Quinn kind of smiled and nodded. I'm not sure what in his head he was thinking at the time. But to me, it was an example of disrupting that narrative, that the church is the one that pushed him out. I think thinking about it as an exchange and thinking about the new kinds of relationships that he was forming is really helpful in that. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and I think I neglected one right here. So the question is for Dr. Patterson, and it has to do with heteronormative narratives and the way that Quinn is claiming his own kind of narrative there.
Thank you for that question too. I think in this narrative of linear rise and then descent, and its emphasis on aloneness, it almost appears sometimes in those narratives as though his family disappears after he comes out. And that's very problematic. From what I have read, of course, it was difficult for the family, but those relationships continued. It was a different notion of family. But my understanding from reading is that he continued a relationship with his ex-wife, and that he continued relationships with his children. So the family is still there. It just looks different from what the expectation is about family. And so to me, that's an example of queering time, is embracing other notions of family.
We've had a fantastic panel. I have been enlightened and thoroughly enjoyed this. Thank you for your participation. Please join with me in thanking our panelists. And then I'll just note that the next panel begins at 11. Thank you.